Welcome to Baltic Beauty, a conversation with David Rifkind, brought to you by Architectural Adventures. This webinar will provide you with a detailed view of the Architectural Adventures trip to the Baltic, occurring June 8th through the 17th in 2017. Before we get started with our conversation with David, I wanted to share a little bit about Architectural Adventure Tours with you. Architectural Adventures is the official travel program of the American Institute of Architects. We work with tour operators to provide travelers with expert-led tours that will focus on the architecture, culture, and history of premier destinations. We specialize in small group travel that will provide you with an immersive experience. Our approach to travel is that we want to give all of our travelers an opportunity to explore the world's architecture with like-minded individuals. You'll receive educational guidance and commentary from knowledgeable and engaging experts who offer unique insight through formal and informal discussions. You'll also have an opportunity to participate in special excursions, exclusive behind-the-scenes access, and also get insider knowledge to popular sites as well as lesser-known sites as well. The subject matter expert for this trip is David Rifkind. David is an associate professor at the Department of Architecture at Florida International University. David, can you share a little bit about yourself?
I'd be happy to. I'm trained as an architect and still practice architecture, but I'm also trained as an architectural historian, and I came to FIU about 9 years ago to teach architectural history and theory courses. And since then, I've also added Associate Dean of Students for the college to my resume.
Great. Well, let's go ahead and get started with the itinerary of the Baltic trip that you'll be leading. So day one of the itinerary, travelers will depart their gateway city. Day two, travelers will embark on the MS Laboreal. So this is an exclusively chartered 5-star ship for this trip. The ship has 110 French suites and staterooms. Each features a private bathroom, television, Wi-Fi access, and many other 5-star hotel amenities. Travelers on the ship will also enjoy international dining, a theater, library, and also activities such as swimming, a spa, and fitness equipment. Day three. So day three starts this itinerary, and travelers are going to disembark in Gdansk. This is Poland's principal seaport and its 6th largest metropolitan area. So David, what can you tell us about the history and our architectural significance of Gdansk?
Gdansk is a really gorgeous city, and it's been a very wealthy trading center since the Middle Ages. And much of the city that we see now is the city that had developed as this important trading center, a key city in the Hanseatic League, and then also a major site for shipbuilding as well as for commerce and trade. One of the interesting things about the city, though, is that it's largely reconstructed. During the Second World War, it was almost entirely destroyed, and so this really beautiful medieval city that we have is reconstructed exactingly from plans and from images that were available to the Polish government in the post-war period. So they used things like paintings and lithographs, making sure that they were true to the original colors and all of the detailing of the buildings. So much of what we'll visit is reconstructed in a really loving way. And Gdansk is also an important city because the architecture shows a number of different influences. Because it was a major commercial trading center, there are sort of architectural elements that you associate with other areas in not only in the Baltic, but in the North Sea and Low Countries. So there's an architectural heritage that's really synthetic, that shares elements that you find from a large part of Western Europe and Northern Europe. But the other thing that's really interesting about it, too, is its more recent history, because Gdansk is the site of the great shipyards where Lech Walesa worked as an electrician, and he was the leader of the Solidarity labor movement and eventually became the first president of Poland after the end of communism. And so modern Gdansk also has several really fascinating museums, including a Solidarity Center, which is one of the more interesting modern buildings that we'll see on our trip.
travelers can expect to have a full day here. As the image even depicts, this is such a colorful place, so very, very interesting.
Yeah.
So moving on to Tallinn. So on this day, we'll be visiting Tallinn and the surviving Gothic-style hall in Europe that's there. What can you tell us about this structure and this town?
Tallinn is also a really lovely city. It's the capital of Estonia, and the city has preserved its medieval core, and it actually has two different centers to it. One is the low city, which is where the town hall is, and then there's the high city, which we see in the slide here, which is an old citadel and has a major church and former fortifications. The town hall itself is a fascinating building because its origins go all the way back to the 13th century, and it was completed in the late Middle Ages. It's, in a way, it's representative of a building type that used to exist all over Europe, but unfortunately there's very few of them left. It's a town hall where the lower level is basically market spaces that are that open up onto the Great Town Square through a big arcade. And so the building is lifted up on this arcade with the commercial spaces below, and then the main town meeting hall up above. And then it's got a great steep gable roof and a tower. But it's one of the better preserved medieval meeting halls of its type in all of Europe.
Excellent. The next day will be the first morning that travelers will begin a tour in St. Petersburg. And they'll actually start the day with the Hermitage Museum. So can you tell us a little bit about this museum?
Yeah, the Hermitage is spectacular. The collection, it's the kind of place that you'll spend the day there and then sort of long to go back for a week or more. It's like the Louvre or the Met in that way. And it began as the private collection of the czars. It's a fantastic collection, but the collection also continued up into the present day. And so even in Soviet Russia, they continued to amass masterpieces, some of which were appropriated from private citizens. And so there's fantastic works by Matisse. There's also some very rare works by early Soviet artists like Kazimir Malevich there. So it's a really extraordinary artistic experience.
There'll also be visiting of iconic churches while in St. Petersburg. What can you tell us about what travelers might expect to see in terms of churches?
Yeah, there's two major churches that we'll see that are going to, that really frame the history of St. Petersburg, because St. Petersburg is also the city that helps you understand the history of modern Russia. Prior to the 1700s, Russia was centered on Moscow, its traditional capital. But Moscow is a city that really straddles Europe and Asia, and it feels very distant from Europe, in particular because travel over land before the 18th century was very arduous. So when Peter the Great came to power at the end of the 17th century, he set about on a whole process of modernization, doing a number of things like changing the language that was spoken at court. He changed it from Russian to French. He changed the calendar, adopting the Gregorian calendar, and he adopting the Julian calendar, and then he also did a number of other reforms. And one of them was that he wanted to change the capital, moving it to St. Petersburg, to a place that he had captured in an early war on the Baltic, so that he would have a major seaport, but more importantly, he would also have a city that was more oriented toward Western Europe. So St. Petersburg, even though it seems very far north, and it also is more easily accessible from the rest of Europe by sea. And so it became his window on the West, his opening to the rest of Europe. And as such, the architecture represents this translation from an older traditional Russian style of architecture to what he considered more modern and European architecture. He invited architects from France and from Italy to come to St. Petersburg, and he kind of reimagined it almost like a Venice of the North. And so most of the architecture is very neoclassical from that first part of the construction of the city during the 18th century. And the building that we'll see that really represents that is St. Isaac's Cathedral. It's built right at the beginning of the 19th century during that great wave of Greek Revival architecture. And it's very much in line with the architecture of somebody like Schinkel in Prussia, or any of the great Greek Revival architects in the United States and in England. But it's a building that is very consistent with the neoclassicism of St. Petersburg, and thus it represents that notion of Western architecture as being associated with modernity and worldliness. And by comparison, we'll also see the Church of the Savior on Blood, which is the church that was built at the beginning of the 20th century to mark the spot where Tsar Alexander II was assassinated. And so this is a building where that whole notion of the spilled blood is, it's a double entendre. It refers both to the Tsar and to Christ. But it's a building that is thoroughly medieval in its architecture. It looks a lot like like St. Basil's Cathedral in Red Square in Moscow. And this is an example of romantic nationalism, the idea that architecture should harken back to a very specific and place-bound notion of identity. And this is going to be familiar to anyone who's traveled in places like in England, where you've seen the Gothic revivals of Ruskin, or in Budapest, where you see the great romantic nationalism, also of that same period at the beginning of the 20th century. And so anyway, so the Church of the Savior on Blood is this building that represents a great contrast with St. Isaac's Cathedral. And so we'll have a chance really to see in the architecture a whole history of Tsarist Russia.
What a day. That sounds like a really full day.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So the next day, the tour is going to continue, and the group will take a coach to the town of Pushkin, and you'll be visiting the Catherine Palace. And the Catherine Palace was a Rococo structure, and it was also the summer residence of the Tsar. So what can you tell us in addition about this palace?
Well, Pushkin is a really interesting place. It's about 20 miles outside of St. Petersburg, and it served as a summer residence, which was a traditional thing in Europe for people to escape the heat of the city. Because even though St. Petersburg is really far north, and we'll have those wonderful white nights where the sky will remain fairly bright at night, it still does get pretty warm up there. And so the Tsars would retreat to their summer palaces, like the Catherine Palace in Pushkin. And so it has a kind of a Versailles quality to it. It's from early on in the history of St. Petersburg. It's the work of Catherine I, who also was, again, looking to Western sources. She hired a German architect to build for herself this beautiful summer palace, and she imagined it a lot like Versailles, as a kind of a retreat outside of the city. It is Rococo, which is really interesting because it's got this kind of really voluptuous quality. It's a kind of almost a playful version of the Baroque, where the architecture is very plastic, it's very brightly colored, gilded broadly, and so there's a kind of a wonderful sense of the association of the countryside with pleasure, and especially with physical pleasure and the delight of the senses. So that's really what this palace is meant to evoke.
Incredible. So the next day, the group will disembark in the Finnish capital, and here the tour will be focusing on Finland's most prominent architecture schools of the last 150 years. So this is an exclusive tour to architectural adventures travelers on this day. So what can you tell us about what travelers may see during this exclusive tour?
Yeah, Helsinki is also a really, really wonderful city. It's got a delightful scale to it. It's much smaller than Stockholm or St. Petersburg. And so it's a city that's really easy to traverse on foot or to move around by vehicle. And you'll have a chance to see some really, really extraordinary architecture. The city is, it's mostly developed in the last 2 centuries. It had to do with the city's position between Russia and Sweden, and it's the sort of perennial wars between those two kingdoms. But as Helsinki was developed in the 19th and 20th centuries, you get the emergence of some really remarkable urban spaces. The cathedral that we see on the slide here is another one of these early 19th century neoclassical monuments. And then it sort of sets the stage for a series of buildings which each represent these great periods of the city's history. There's the train station by Eliel Saarinen, the father of Eero Saarinen. And Eliel Saarinen's cathedral, it will look really familiar to people who know his work in the United States, like Cranbrook Academy's campus. And Saarinen's train station is another one of these kind of transitional buildings in that romantic nationalist mode where the architecture is not terribly classical. It's meant to evoke local traditions. And a lot of people often associate him with Louis Sullivan in that way, as an architect who's trying to understand the sort of innate qualities of local architecture. But the architect in Helsinki who best exemplifies that whole urge, to represent national identity through modern architecture, is Alvar Aalto. And there are several major works by Aalto in Helsinki. So we'll have a chance to see those, especially the great Finlandia Hall, the large concert hall just on the northern edge of the city. And then finally, what I'm hoping we'll get a chance to see too is the Kiasma Museum by Stephen Hole, which was just completed in the last decade. But it's an elegant museum right in the center of Helsinki, and it gives you an opportunity to see the work by one of America's, I think, one of the better practicing architects in the United States, but a man whose work is, it's not easy to access unless you live near one of these great works like in Kansas City or in Seattle or now in New York City. So we'll have a chance to see really amazing works of architecture from different parts of the history of modern Finland.
That sounds great. Now the next day, the group will sail west and go to the island of Gotland and disembark in the city of Visby. What can you tell us about this city?
Well, Visby is also quite small. It's quite compact, and it gives you a chance to walk around. It'll almost feel like a trip to the country after visiting the major cities like St. Petersburg and Helsinki. And so the part that I love most about Gotland and about Visby is just that almost that rural quality. Visby itself is a lovely little city. Again, it's great to wander around. The biggest thrill I get from being there is the number of wind turbines all around. It's in a particularly windy part of the Baltic, and so it's one of those places that's almost entirely powered by renewable energy, which is kind of exciting. But at the same time, Visby is an elegant city. There's a really beautiful ruined church that we'll have a chance to visit. And other than that, it'll also offer you an opportunity to get away and spend some time in just a really lovely island just in the surrounded by open ocean.
Well, wonderful, and sadly, that will bring us to an end of this tour. We will disembark in Stockholm. After breakfast aboard the ship, travelers will then take their transfers to the airport and return flights back home. But certainly, travelers are in for a treat having you be the expert of this trip, and they will be learning a lot. So we thank you so much for leading the trip as well as what you've been able to share with us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
For any questions regarding this trip or any other tours led by Architectural Adventures, please contact 1-800-293-5725 or email travel@architecturaladventures.org. You can also visit our website to sign up for updates at architecturaladventures.org and also view itineraries for other trips that we have scheduled in 2017.